Hi, Made by Sue here, and today I'm making a double arrow quilt block. It'll measure 12.5 inches when I'm done piecing it together and will finish in your quilt project at 12 inches square. So let's take a closer look at the block. The block consists of one large square in the center, surrounded by these rectangles in threes on the top, bottom, and the sides. And then in the corner we have these squares that are composed of a half square triangle and then two quarter square triangles. And because of the layout, it creates these arrows, and my arrows are in the pink and yellow. For this block, I'm using some fabrics from this fat quarter bundle that I picked up at Walmart. It's by Waverly, and I just love these spring colors, and I picked out 3 for the block. And then I'm also using some yardage I picked up at Joann's, and it's from their Keepsake Calico collection. And it's black with some colorful dots that coordinate with the fat quarter bundle colors. Out of my black fabric, I've cut 1 6.5 inch square and 2 4-inch squares. Out of the pink and yellow fabrics, the fabrics for the arrows, cut 1 each 4.5 inch squares and 2 each 1.5 by 7-inch strips. Now you can cut these pink and yellow strips at 1.5 by 6.5 inches. I'm choosing to overcut them because I want to trim them down after the strips are sewn together to 6.5 inches. And out of my turquoise, I'm cutting 8 1.5 by 7-inch strips. Again, the same thing here. You can cut them at 1.5 by 6.5 if you want to. To make this patch here, which is your half square triangle with your 2 quarter square triangles, you're going to use your 4-inch squares in black and your 4.5-inch squares in yellow and pink. I'll use these 2 squares, the 4.5-inch squares, to make 2 half square triangle patches. And I won't go through the whole thing because I've made these so many times on my videos, but I'll just do a quick run through. So you'll put these fabrics right sides together and draw a line corner to corner, and then stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of your drawn line. Then cut apart on your drawn line, and you'll have 2 half square triangle patches. Then I pressed and squared these each up to 4 inches square. Now draw a line from one corner to the other using your ruler. And you notice you're going perpendicular to your seam line. Then right sides together with your black 4-inch squares. And sew 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of your drawn line. And cut on your drawn line. And that'll give you 4 patches, just enough for your block. At the seam, and I'm pressing toward my dark fabric. And I'll repeat that with the other 3 patches. Squaring up this unit is the same exact technique as you use for a regular half square triangle. So using a square up ruler, align the diagonal line on your ruler with your diagonal seam on the block. Make sure that there's a little bit of fabric overhanging the 3.5 inch mark on all 4 sides. You can see right here and right here pretty clearly. And holding the ruler steady in place, make 2 cuts. Then flip the block around. This time when we line it up, we're lining it up on these two sides at exactly 3.5 inches. So again, the diagonal line in line with your seam, and then at exactly 3.5 inches, and make the final 2 cuts. Three and a half inches square. And I'll repeat that on the other 3 patches off camera. I have my 7-inch by 1.5 inch strips, 2 yellow, 2 pink, 8 turquoise, and I'll just place the turquoise on top, right sides together. I'll take it to the machine and I'll sew along the edge of each one of these sets a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And here's why I overcut these by 1/2 inch length, because I don't want to have to worry about matching up these short ends exactly. I can concentrate on matching up my sides. And it just makes it easier for me. The sewing is more fun, and I'll just go back later, I'll show you, and trim these up exactly. And again, I don't have to worry about matching up these ends, which to me just makes it so much easier. I've clipped them apart, and I'll press toward the darker fabric, which is my turquoise. And I'll repeat that on my other 3 sets. Now with the 4 remaining turquoise strips, again, right sides together, and again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here, which I will do off camera. I have all my units pressed, and I'm just doing a quick measure to make sure that they're 3.5 inches wide, which this one looks really nice. If it didn't measure 3.5 inches and it was a little bit short, then I would go back and sew these together with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. But the 1/4 inch seam allowance worked really well for this. And what I'll do first is just trim the edge off to get a nice straight edge. So I'll just line up the bottom and trim right here. Now I'll flip my block around. My nice straight edges here. I'll line up this line at my 6.5 inches and then line up on one of my straight lines here. And that'll give me a nice 6.5 inch long block. And then I'll just trim the end right here. And cut. Now I know that that's exactly 6.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and I'll repeat that on my other patches. Now I have all my units ready to assemble the block, and I just wanted to point out really quickly, on these units, the way that I made them, you'll end up with 2 blocks where the yellow is on the top and 2 blocks where the yellow is on the side. And of course the pink, same thing. I just wanted to point that out in case you use that technique to make some other block and maybe you need them all in the same direction. Now that I've got all my patches laid out in their proper places, I'll go ahead and pin. This is just a rough pin, and I'll do it more precisely when I take these over to the sewing machine. So I know I've showed this before, but I like to pin in the direction that I'll be sewing. So that means I'll start here and then sew this direction. Okay, I'll take these over to the machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance down each side. I have my leader fabric, my 1/4 inch presser foot, Now I'll carefully line this up. And when I'm pressing these two rows toward my smaller patch. So I set the seam and then press toward that patch. And I've already pressed that one. Move those out of the way. And so my center, I want to press in the opposite direction. So I'll press toward my center. That means I'll have that one on top facing me, and then finger press and press toward that center. That way my seam allowances will be going in the opposite direction when I go to join the block together. And I'll show you what I mean. So this seam allowance right here is going in this direction, and this seam allowance is going in this direction. That way when I put these together, it'll be nice and easy to match up that seam, and then there won't be as much bulk because one will be here and the other on the other side. Now I'll flip these right sides together, take it to the machine, and off camera I will sew again a 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here. I have the pieces all pressed. Now I can attach each end to my center. So as usual, right sides together. And this time I'll need to match these seams, which shouldn't be a problem since I've pressed them in the opposite directions. I'll grab my pins, match up, and pin. And you can use fabric glue here too, or I should say instead of the pinning. Okay, I'll take it to the machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here. Then I'll attach my other panel off camera. Set my seam. And I'll just press toward the outside. I really like how this point turned out. Very, very nice. This one we won't really talk about. It got a little eaten up in the seam, but that happens. And I'll give it a final measure. It should measure at 12.5 inches square, and that looks really good. It'll finish in your quilt project at 12 inches square.